Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. For most of the developed world, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration represents the gold standard for testing, approval, and regulation of new drugs and treatments. But what if FDA goes astray, as it appears to be the case with vaping? With each passing day, FDA's approach grows further afield from countries like the United Kingdom and its good neighbor to the north, Canada, which this spring passed a law titled Bill S-5 that made vaping products illegal, including flavors. Just a short few years ago, Canada took its cues from the U.S., but today a new North American alliance of advocacy groups is hoping to reverse that direction. Joining us today is Mark Keeley, Chief Government Negotiator for the Canadian Vaping Association, and Larry Flick, Head of Federal Policy and Government Relations for the American E-Liquid Manufacturing Standards Association. Hi, gentlemen. Good to have you both here.
Good to be here, Brent.
Indeed, all again for both of you. Larry, let's first start with you. Seeing it's the U.S. that needs the most help here, tell us about the new North American Vapor Alliance and why it's needed.
Well, thanks again, Brent. We're very excited about this new announcement and this new alliance. I sort of started almost a year ago. I went up to meet with Mark and the president of CVA, Sean Casey, and the whole team at CVA. And I wanted to learn more, quite frankly, about what they were doing, because I saw that they were being effective.
So, Mark, obviously there are some lessons to be learned then from the U.S. by Canada. Is that really the goal here?
No, I got to put it to you this way. The organization that Larry heads up, AMSA, is, in my opinion, is also the gold standard in terms of the manufacture of standards. And I think we need to demonstrate in Canada right now a little more leadership from the industry as it relates to the development of standards. So the government is extolling that kind of a mantra on top of the Canadian Vaping Association. It's as a matter of course, it's probably a good idea that Canada and the United States, these two organizations that Larry and I are part of, join forces to do that kind of thing. So I think this is wonderful.
Larry?
I agree 100%. We as we were just talking over the past several months about what CVA was doing, what AMS has been doing in the U.S., it became clear that we were aligned. We actually have released a set of shared principles, which form the basis for how we as an industry can behave responsibly, put forward standards that the regulators can adopt and enforce. We do have an opportunity to work together, both on the standards, which can be used by both regulators, and on the bigger framework, including part of our alliance will include a very aggressive industry-led youth prevention and protection program. And we are committed to demonstrating how serious as an industry in the U.S. and how serious the Canadian industry is about preventing and protecting youth, educating retailers on how to make sure that there's no access to youth. And, we understand that issue in and of itself is paramount to those that we've been sort of across the table from. I think that, Canada brings a lot of credibility to what they've done with regard to youth prevention and protection, and we're willing to do the same thing in the U.S. So we think being able to point to a responsible, friendly neighbor who's doing it, we think effectively and working effectively with their regulator is really a good template that we can bring to our regulator, the FDA here in the States.
And I want to add to that, Brent. It's very interesting. Right now in Canada, we have there's limited bandwidth in terms of the regulatory infrastructure that exists by government to manage things like, this new Tobacco and Vape Products Act, or Bill S-5, as you call it. And we've got cannabis legislation that's coming in for full-blown recreational cannabis. And then we've got other issues around food and NAFTA that are really taking a lot of airtime away from things like vaping. So if we could put some kind of a cross-border attempt and the heft of AIMSA and what's happening in terms of standards development from the United States into what we're doing to present to Canada, that to me demonstrates to the world or globally that this organization that we've created, the NAVA we're calling it, would have the heft that's going to be available in Canada to assist the government to not only to craft, but to develop to implement the regulations that they want to put in place, and obviously the changes that we aspire to make in the United States. I think this is, like I said, this has the hallmarks of something that could really go global for us.
So, Larry, do you think the FDA will be responsive to hearing lessons and messages from other countries?
Well, I do. We know that Public Health Canada and FDA have a close working relationship. Their policy people talk to our policy people. So we think if we can do it jointly and in parallel fashion, it really demonstrates that it's the correct approach, that both sides see it the same way, and we have a parallel approach that the two align.
And you know, too, Brent, it's not like this is a surprise. We've actually given Health Canada in our nation's capital a heads up that there's this kind of alliance that's being contemplated. And they actually said to us, well, we do talk quite regularly with the FDA, as Larry had suggested at the outset, but our organizations at this industry level have not. So I think this is music to Health Canada's ears.
Mark, let me ask you this question. You've mentioned a couple of times the global question. Yeah. I can certainly tell you that a lot of Americans are not familiar with just how much of an impact the World Health Organization has in a detrimental way on vaping in the US. Coming from Canada, that pressure also was on Canada for a while. Tell our viewers in the States about the dangers around the WHO and what that means for vaping.
Well, you know, it's an interesting comment, and like, I don't want to put myself in a position to cast aspersions on the WHO. It's an important organization. It does good work. There are a number of initiatives that have occurred as a result of the World Health Organization with poverty, women's health, et cetera, et cetera. But as it relates to this, they have what they call conferences of the parties. And COP7, and you recall because you were there, had suggested in those days that this issue on vaping was so misunderstood, I'm going to say misunderstood by the World Health Organization, that it co-opted a number of countries. And the way it works, Brent, and both Larry and I know this intuitively, is that the WHO entices countries to sign on to conventions, in this particular case under the COP7, not to support vaping, lest they be told they won't get money from the WHO. I'm not certain that the United States has even an inkling of how the WHO goes around with their conventions. There's a COP8 that's happening in France coming up this year, and we're going to be there, both Larry and I, under NAVA, as a loud voice to say, don't get sucked into a convention that deems vaping to be like tobacco, and it's harmful. We've made the point very clearly in Canada that we're, just like the UK has, we're magnitudes less harmful than smoking cigarettes, and that should be celebrated as a viable option against combustible cigarettes.
So, Larry, the Alliance, NAVA, could present a unified front for North America at the WHO, at the World Health Organization, at COP8.
Absolutely, and we will work closely with our respective governmental entities to get that message loud and clear to the Conference of Parties.
I want to chime in here, Brent, because I think there are other countries right now, India as an example, who've reached out to us to say, how do we do what you've done in Canada and our country? Because if you recall, under the COP7, they had signed on to the convention. So now they're looking at perhaps growing their nascent industry in India, because they know that smoking is harmful. And if you look at it, we've now been approached by countries in South America and Africa now about the same kind of issues. The fact that you've got both a United States very, very well-regarded and standards-based organization like AIMSA and the Canadian Vaping Association that have done a wonderful job in terms of working collaboratively with government and governments across Canada on regulation and legislative initiatives, there's a curiosity now. And I think that when I say global, I think that people will look at that and say that ought to be the gold standard for moving forward on collaboration and cooperation with government in a regulatory framework.
So Larry, with all due respect to everybody in Canada that lives under a regime that's now, pro-vaping to a large extent, which was a pleasant surprise and much needed. The US, though, appears to be that it's not the case. And I'm going to truncate here a minute, which I think might be your argument that, thanking Commissioner Gottlieb for the deeming regulation extension. But if things don't get sorted out, he's a political appointee. And this could all go back to the Democrats and the progressive left, and seeing how much opposition there is by progressive nonprofit public health groups, which is just relentless. How can anybody say vaping is on sure footing in the United States?
Well, that's one reason why this alliance is so meaningful. Quite frankly, in Canada, it's the progressives that have taken the harm reduction policy under their wings and adopted it. For whatever reason, that's not been the case in the U.S. The liberals and progressives have viewed this as big tobacco, which we know it's not. They viewed it as trying to addict another generation onto nicotine as a gateway to cigarettes, which it's proven not to be. So I think being able to point to what's happened in Canada, how the science continues to develop on our side. But the time is now, and that's why this alliance is so critical. We want to be able to point to what Canada is doing so that, again, the progressives up there can we can message to the Democrats down here in the U.S. that, there's more one way to view this issue. And quite frankly, I think this alliance can be very, very helpful in turning that paradigm around.
Mark, let me ask you, is there some validity to that?
There sure is. And one of the things that we've suggested, and the government here in Canada has taken us up on that, is what we've affectionately called a best brains exchange.
As Mark indicated, we've already talked about getting a delegation of the thought leaders and politicians that have been leaders in Ottawa to come down to Washington, D.C. And meet with their counterparts and vice versa. So I think it'll prove to be very effective.
There are going to be people in the advocacy community in the U.S. that are going to be skeptical of this alliance.
Well, you know what? If that's the case, please talk to us. We have an open door policy, and we're willing to meet and talk with anyone in the U.S., both in terms of individual companies, other organizations, consumer groups, public health organizations, tobacco harm reduction advocates. I've sensed a real change that people are looking for a standards-based system where if you check all the boxes and you can demonstrate to the FDA that your manufacturing processes are first rate, your component ingredients are all pure and up to speed in terms of what is necessary for quality control, then you should be allowed on the marketplace. And that's the framework we're looking for. It allows for innovation, it allows for improvement in products, and it doesn't result in just a few big companies or big tobacco companies or big vape companies owning the entire industry. We want to get as much innovation and entrepreneurship as possible.